Hey, deserving listeners. Today I'm going to talk about giving advice to instructors. As an instructor in a master's program for the past 20 years, I have a lot of things to say, and someone sent me an email, but before we talk about that, let's introduce the podcast. This is called the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I am a therapist and a professor, and I received an email a long time ago from patron Emily. She was asking about advice about how to be a good instructor in a master's program. She wrote me a long time ago about advice about how to be a good professor or how to prepare for being a college instructor. And I talked a little bit about it with Rebecca on the podcast, but we ran out of time. So I just wanted to fully answer this question. Although I won't be able to fully answer it here because when you do anything as complicated as being as a professor for 20 years, you just have a lot of things to say about it. So it'd be like me summing up how to be a therapist, really. So, but these are the main things that I have found to be quick things I can say that are I think useful that I try to keep in my mind. And I've hired and trained a lot of college instructors in my program, and I find these things to be helpful. So the first thing is to recognize that being a instructor in a master's or doctoral program is a fairly stressful job. There are a lot of factors or a lot of things that are happening. It's not like just showing up at work and doing your time. There are politics. There are students. There are before I started teaching, I thought being an instructor must be this wonderful experience because you're in power and everyone has to listen to you and you don't got to take no shit from nobody because you're in control. But what I realized was when you're an instructor, you don't really feel that power because you care, right? You don't want to ruin people's lives. And when a student comes to you and says that they're struggling and they're upset and they believe that you have not done a good enough job teaching them, then, I guess you sort of have the power to tell them to fuck off, but most of us don't want to do that. And we end up feeling a lot of the stress, like, oh crap, well, I have to figure out a way to help this student, but what if the student doesn't rise to the occasion and I end up having to fail this student? What does that mean? Am I going to get in trouble? Is the student going to hate me? Are they going to show up the next day with a gun and shoot me? I mean, believe me, at 20 years of being an instructor, I've thought about all the things. And that's a very stressful spot to be in. As a therapist, which many of us are before we become instructors, in programs, we don't often have that. We're not often put in that position. As an instructor, you are put in a position at times about to make the decision to whether or not someone survives in this field. And the students are paying thousands upon thousands of dollars for it. They're dedicating a lot of their time. Their ego's wrapped up in it. They have a lot of transferences to you, and it can be very stressful. So just recognize that. It doesn't mean that it's a terrible job, but it definitely is a heightened experience. The next thing is to make sure that you really want to be an instructor because, again, the stress is high. So what I tell people when they ask me, like, oh, I'm thinking about becoming an instructor, what I tell people is, well, the first thing you have to do is figure out if you really want to do this because it's a craft that takes years to develop. I didn't really feel confident in my teaching ability until maybe 10 years into it. Now, granted, for the first 10 years I taught, it was really part-time. Most of the time, I pretty much just taught one class a quarter. But still, 10 years of doing something before I felt confident, and maybe even longer, maybe even more like 15 years before I felt like I do now, which is feeling nervous about teaching. For the first 10 or 15 years, before teaching, I would get butterflies in my stomach, and it would really stress me out. And I'd be teaching which feels like being on stage. And I would feel my nerves kind of pumping, especially at the beginning of the quarter. So you really have to figure out if you want to do it. And the other thing is there's not a lot of money in it. I didn't realize this, but instructors, they're always teachers are always talking about, oh, we don't get paid enough. Well, college is no exception. College instructors don't get paid that much either. I basically, from the beginning, have always taken a pay cut in order to teach. If I was just a clinician, I could make so much more money, but people don't do it for the money. You got to love it. You got to consider it a calling. Instructors, that's how they feel about it. It's like, well, it's a calling. This is not something that you do for money. Now, surely you can be paid, and surely you can be paid fairly well eventually, but not to the extent of your place in the profession. A lot of people think of it. It's like, oh, you're a clinician, and then you get sort of promoted to the position of supervisor and of instructor, and therefore you should be paid a lot more than your underlings, right? Well, I train people who go on to earn more money than I do because they never go into academia and they stay in the clinical world. So it's not you're not in it for the money. And for example, when I looked at how much I got paid when I first started teaching. Now this is 20 years ago, so inflation, but inflation isn't that bad. And I was paid $1,000 per course 20 years ago when I first started, which worked out to be at best $10 an hour, because the amount of time I spent on teaching and driving to the university and correcting papers. Oh my God, it takes so long to correct papers, do grades. At Antioch, we don't just give out letter grades, we write narrative evaluations. And so they're basically like mini papers that we write on every single student, detailing what they did and what they did well, what they needed to work on. And so when you added all that up, I was getting paid about $10 an hour. And that's pretty dismal, right? So and it was super stressful. Way more stressful than my regular, clinical job. So you had to love it, and I did. And I didn't have time for it back then either, but I made time for it because it's exciting, it's interesting, it gets the blood pumping, you learn a lot. It feels good to succeed at a challenge like that. And so, but for many people, that does not appeal to them. They're just like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I like teaching that much. I don't know if I can take the pay cut, all that kind of stuff. So that's another thing. And that's fine. If it's not your calling, then, you just have to admit that to yourself, and that's fine. The next piece of advice I have is that if you do get hired, or when you get hired, or when you're working as an instructor, often what you are is an adjunct instructor, meaning that you're kind of a gun for hire. You're contracted to teach maybe just one class, and that's it. And you are kind of an outsider. And there are a lot of benefits to being an outsider because you don't have to deal with all the meetings and all the politics. But the downside to being an outsider is that you feel very isolated. And whenever I work with adjuncts, they will always say that. And that's how because I was an adjunct for, 15 years or something, to 12 years. And I felt completely outside the loop. And even though I had people's phone numbers and I had people's email addresses, somehow it just never felt like I was a part of the team. And there's something really great about being part of the team. You can get advice from people pretty quickly. You can get advice about the politics. You get a better sense of the landscape. You understand the field a little better. You can help the students. You learn about how to teach better. But the most important thing to me when I became much more integrated into the program about 10 years ago and started really having colleagues who were instructors was that I got support on working with difficult students. Every quarter you have at least one student who is a concern of yours, whether they are outwardly hostile towards you, or they're disruptive in class somehow, or they present something that makes you rather concerned about their development as a clinician, or they do something unethical, or they don't turn things in on time, or the list just goes on and on. So every quarter you're going to have a student like that. Sometimes you'll have 3 or 4 students who are like that. And when you are alone dealing with those stresses, it is so much more difficult emotionally and practically to deal with than when you have the support of your colleagues. When I got the support of my colleagues, I would go to them and I'd say, so I have this student and he is turning things in he's turning things in late, and the things he turns in late are not well done. There's a lot of typos. He doesn't seem to understand the material. He doesn't even seem to be using the course material. What should I do? I feel like I want to flunk this person, but I don't know. And my colleagues would almost always say, well, it sounds like you're making a good case that this student doesn't deserve credit in your course. And I'd be like, yeah, I guess so. And my colleagues would be like, well, then flunk him by all means, and you have our full support. In fact, I encourage you to do so, because we need to send a message to some of these students who are not performing well, that they need to put more time in, or maybe this profession is not for them. And I'd be like, oh, thank you so much. It was always that. And whenever someone came to me, I always tried to reciprocate in that way and just be like, if you as an instructor have determined that this student is not rising above the threshold of a passing grade, then not only do I fully support your decision to fail this student, but I sort of recommend that you do it, because we all have to do our part to weed these very few students out. So it's so great to have that support, and it can be so stressful when you're on your own. Now, all this depends on having colleagues that are supportive, having a program director who knows how to manage instructors. So, you just have to figure that out from the organization you're involved with. The next piece of advice that I have to novice instructors is to say, I don't know a lot, or let me check on that. There's this compulsion as an instructor that when a student asks you a question, and they will ask, particularly at Antioch, it's an adult learning environment. And so, these aren't 20-year-old kids who are just sitting there acting like they're listening while they're on Facebook or Insta or something. These are super involved students who are paying a lot of money of their own personal money and consider being a therapist a calling for them, and they take it extremely seriously. And so they're going to ask a lot of questions, and they're going to want to know stuff, and they're going to, and many of your students, if not all of them, will know more about some subjects than you do. And so when they ask questions, or they say things that you don't know much about, there's a compulsion for instructors, and I've felt this myself, to just to just make something up. There's this compulsion of just like, well, I'm the teacher, so therefore I have to have an answer. I'm the teacher, and if I say I don't know, I'm going to look like a fool. But the fact is what instructor knows everything on the planet? It's just, it's not possible. And it's a ridiculous notion. So, and I find that very few teachers will do this. Very few teachers will say something like, that's a great question, and I don't know if I know the answer to that. I'll get back to you on that one. Is that okay? Is it okay if I write that question down and maybe get back to you next week after I talk to some experts on that? Or even just to say, what, that's a great question, and that's not really my area of expertise. And although that question makes total sense, I don't think I'll ever know the answer to that question. So maybe you should ask someone else about that. So just get good at responding in that way. It's almost a better default to have than to assume you know the answer to something. So only answer questions that you feel like you know the answer to. The reason being is obvious, but maybe some reasons that aren't so obvious, is that as a student, when I'm a student in a class and I can tell that an instructor is just making stuff up so that they can seem smart to the students, I completely lose respect for them. I lose respect for everything they're saying, because I realize in that moment that they are willing essentially to deceive me and lie to me that they know an answer that they don't really know the answer to. And therefore, everything they tell me is called into question. I have to wonder about, are they just making all this shit up or are they only making some of the stuff up? Because I can tell they made that answer up. So you gain a lot of trust and credibility when you say, you know what, the things I've been talking about up until this point, I know pretty well, and I've studied a lot, and so I feel very confident in the information I've given you. The question you just asked me, I have a compulsion to answer that question, but honestly, I think I'd be making that up, and I'd be doing you a disservice by answering that question without doing proper research. Plus, it models how to, in the clinical world, it models how to do that when your clients ask you questions, because clients will ask us questions too, and as a therapist, you have to be willing to say, you know what, I don't know, it's a good question. Let me get back to you on that. The next piece of advice is perhaps the most important for novice instructors, which is to build relationships with your students. Don't just teach a class. Novice instructors, including myself for a long time, often concentrate on the quote-unquote teaching of the course, the professional side of the job, rather than building relationships with the students. The way that a student feels while they are in your class is the most important factor in their ability to learn. You could be the best teacher in the world, you could have the best PowerPoints, and you could have the best activities, you could be super smart, but if your student doesn't trust you, or if your student is scared of you, or if your student is kind of walking on eggshells and insecure, or if your student feels unsafe in that group environment, they won't learn anything. Whereas conversely, if your student loves you and feels safe and secure and happy and relaxed and free to move, and you are only half as good of an instructor, then they will learn so much, because people thrive when they feel safe. And the default feeling that students feel is unsafe. Students walk into a class, and by default, all the students will feel unsafe. Now, this is a perspective, and people can argue with me, but I have a lot of evidence for this, not only watching students, but also being a student. And the default sort of state is that students enter a class the first day feeling terrified. Whether they admit it or not, to themselves or not, they are terrified. There's all sorts of signs. And I consider it your job and my job as an instructor to focus on, number one first, is to make everyone feel safe. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be nice. Like, for example, one of the things that I do at the beginning of every quarter is I lay out every way students can fail my course, which I'll get into more in a second. But I explain to the students on the first day, like one of the first things I talk about is how they can fail my class, and how every quarter there's almost at least one student that fails every class that I teach. And that's anxiety provoking, because there are instructors in my program that would never say that. And there are instructors in my program who might have actually never failed a student before because they're really nice people, you know? And so, but I tell them, look, I'm not like that. I have no problem failing students who do not perform or who do not follow the instructions in the syllabus. I have no problem with that. I sleep very well at night, doing that. In fact, I sleep better at night knowing that I am holding a standard that everyone really wants me to uphold. But what I don't do is just end it there. I actually explain every way they can fail the course, and I tell them the process. I tell them that you will be told right away what you are doing that is going to get you flunked, and I will give you a chance to correct it. I will give you very clear behavioral markers on how you can change so that you can get credit in my class. You're not going to, at the end of the quarter, get a pink slip. I'm going to tell you, like, week 3, here's what I see in you that is going to get you failed. I was teaching a class last quarter, and sure enough, week 4 or something, I detected in one student an inability to write well. And so I went to him and I said, and in my head, I thought, I don't think this is going to work. I've been around the block enough times that I don't think in the next few weeks we're going to be able to get this guy up to speed in terms of his ability to write at a graduate level. And this is a very frequent concern to instructors. And I told him, I said, I predict that you are going to fail this class, but I'm not giving up on you. But I just want you to prepare for the distinct possibility that you are going to fail this class. But here's what you can do to try not to fail this class: is you have to write a paper to this standard. This is what I'm seeing in your writing that is not going to work for me or in any class at the university, because this was first quarter people, and he had never written in our program before, and so. I laid it all out, and he was differentiated enough and mature enough and open enough to come to me and say, well, help me out. Like, what do you mean about this? And so as I commended him for that, because a lot of students don't. A lot of students, like, they just clam up and they're like, oh no, I'm intimidated, even though I'm like telling them everything that I can to invite them to talk with me. And a lot of students, they'll just like, I don't know, they just get scared, and they're not mature enough, or they get too transferency and they think I'm their dad, and they can't see the rationality of the job that I'm actually doing as an instructor. Just along those lines, just to tell you the stress that you have to deal with as an instructor, the default reaction that I get from students when I tell them that they have a problem is to be defensive about it. It's like, I can predict it. I'll see something in a student and I'll go to them and I'll be like, look, compared to and I don't want to compare them outwardly to their face, but of course I do compare them, because when I, just for example, when I read their papers, so I'll read 16 papers, and there's always like, I don't know, 5 or 6 that are just stellar. They're just like better papers than I could ever write. And there's nothing that I needed to do to actually teach them. They're just really, really smart, they communicate well, they're mature, they know how to do this stuff. And then there's like a few people in the middle who have some minor issues, maybe some typos or APA formatting issues, or they slightly misunderstood the assignment. And then there's always a bottom, 3 or 4 students who are, compared to the other students, just not as good of a writer and not as smart at being able to integrate the material and utilize it in a way that demonstrates that they understand the material. And when I go to them, I will say something like, so your clarity in this paragraph is not good. In order for me to give you a passing grade on this paper and therefore a passing grade in this course, is you need to demonstrate to me that you can write with clarity and that you can demonstrate that you understand the course material. And from your paper, I don't get that sense. And in my head, I'm very confident in my statement to them. 1, because I've been doing it for 20 years. 2, because I just read the students who were sitting right next to you in the same exact class, and their clarity and their ability to demonstrate that they understood things is without question. That I read their paper and I'm like, wow, that person absorbed the material. They were listening in class. And with instruction, they were able to write a paper that I can stamp, as being definitely a competent paper without any hesitation. I could be like, great paper, good job. You were listening. You were reading the material. You know how to communicate. You know how to think. You know how to integrate things. And you were sitting right next to that student who knocked it out of the park, and you did not demonstrate that you have learned anything in this class. But what I get from them is, well, just things like that they'll say. They'll just be like, well, I talked to some other people and they say my paper's fine. Or I don't get it. Like, I did everything you said I was supposed to do. And I'm like, okay, it's one thing to feel bad, which is totally normal. I get that. There's nothing wrong with having your self-esteem shredded by an instructor telling you that. And by the way, when I tell them this information, I am much nicer than the way I'm describing it right now. I'm only exhibiting my frustration and, I don't know, the dozens of students that I've ran into about this. But I get this reaction like, what? I followed directions? Or what? What do you mean I have APA formatting issues? Like, the Writing Center said my paper was fine. And I'm always like, there's no way the Writing Center said your paper was fine. There's just, or if they did, boy, do they not know what they're talking about. Either way, I'm the instructor of this course, and even if I'm wrong, I'm the one giving you your grade. Plus, I know I'm not wrong because I've been doing this for 20 years, and the student sitting right next to you met the standards, and you did not. So that's just one of those stresses that, patron Emily, you have to deal with as an instructor. You get this pushback from students a lot of the time because, again, for many students, there's a default mode of narcissism of, well, I think my paper is good, therefore you need to know that my paper is good. And what I'm always thinking is, as soon as we get past this stupid defensiveness and this immaturity, the faster we can actually get you to learn something, and which will facilitate you actually passing the class. How about that? How about you put aside your defensiveness and actually listen to the person who was getting paid to teach you and allow me to teach you, and then you can learn something new that is going to help you not only in my class, but all the other classes you're going to take after this. And you will knock it out of the park just like every other student in your next class, or by the end of in the quarter in my class, which is exactly what this student did that I'm talking about from last quarter. He came to me and he said, okay, I felt defensive at first, but I think I know what you're saying. And it's been a while since I've written papers, and I just need your help. So can you explain this to me? And I was like, thank you, God. And thank you, student. And so we sat down and I just went line by line. I want to teach students stuff like that. I want to explain what a topic sentence is. And I want to explain how to organize your thoughts in an academic format that will be pleasing to an instructor. I want to do that. And I consider it to be a learnable skill. Writing, I find a lot of people think is some sort of a talent. And surely there are people who are talented writers, but 99% of writing, particularly in graduate school, it's a skill. It's like being able to golf well, right? You don't expect, having never golfed, to walk out onto a golf course and be expected to hit a hole in one, right? You're like, well, I don't know how to golf, and I'm sure I'm going to suck for a long time. Well, writing is exactly the same way. You have to put in your time. You got to do the reps. You have to write, I don't know, probably a few hundred papers in a particular format of writing before you even kind of understand the form of that communication. And that's what it's been like for me. And I used to think like, oh, I'm a terrible writer. But what I should have been saying was, I haven't written enough. I'm an unpracticed writer is what I should have said to myself. So anyway, all this is to say that it's incredibly important to have a good relationship with your students, because when you enter into those difficult spaces, if you have a good relationship with a student, meaning that you know them, they know you, they like you like them, you trust them, they trust you, that you can have an actual conversation about these fairly tense topics. Not only are you stressed out because you want to be a good instructor, but the students are terrified and all sorts of weird things come up. And, every instructor who ever hurt them, every instructor who ever made them feel humiliated or stupid or afraid, they will transfer that onto you. Every authority figure, for that matter, every police officer, every parent, every boss they've ever had that they have experienced bad things with, all of those feelings will emerge, and students will become distorted about you. And you for them, honestly, because you're a part of the system as well. And you will, as an instructor, every relational problem that you've ever had will emerge and affect the way that you feel and react to your students. And so the better the relationship, the better you will be able to see through those distortions from both ends, and better able to get the job done, which is to teach the students, to bring them forward from wherever they're at, to help them to understand what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are and what they need to work on, and to give them a path to working on those weaknesses. And when you have a good relationship with those students, things go much better. When you don't have a good relationship with your students, oh my God, things can go very badly. As a program director and a colleague of many instructors, as I've said before, Antioch University, our master's program is I believe the largest in the region. We're hiring all the time. And in our master's program, I'm guessing in a year from now, our master's program will have close to 40. And then when you include the doctoral programs, I'm guessing we would have 50 full-time faculty and probably 200 adjuncts. So I have a lot of experience listening to other instructors' stories about what they're stressed out about, and including my own. And almost all the time, what instructors are most stressed out about are situations that I believe could have been solved if they had a better relationship with those students. What I have seen is that when students feel like they are unsafe, or they can't trust their instructor, or the instructor is sort of against them or doesn't care about them, it doesn't matter how good the instructor is, the students will revolt. They'll either hate the class or they'll give up and just, go to Snapchat during class, or they'll just be in survival mode and just be like, I just got to get through this. Or they will attack you. And the way that they attack you is by talking with other students and trying to trump up a accusation that will stick with the administration. And then they'll go to the administration and they will attack you. Now, this has never happened to me. Thank God. I think because I focus on the relationship so heavily. I learned this a long time ago. But I see instructors where this happens regularly, where a group of students will build a coalition and complain directly to the administration about how bad of an instructor you are. And often what ends up happening is the students, because they don't really know how to critique teaching, they will often come up with complaints that don't really make a lot of sense to administration. They'll say like, oh, the person uses PowerPoint too much or something like that. And it's like, that's probably not what is bothering you about this instructor. What's probably bothering you about the instructor is you don't feel safe. And you don't feel like the instructor is really concerned with your well-being. And students don't feel like they have the right to complain about that, or even the self-awareness to know that that's even what they're feeling. And so they look for some excuse as to why they're feeling shitty, and they'll come up with things like, this instructor dresses funny, or the instructor used offensive language or something. And, for me, you've listened to this podcast, I use offensive language sometimes. And if a student didn't feel safe in my class, they would latch onto that as something that they could complain about me, what they feel like they can complain about me legitimately, rather than saying, which I believe to be the much more legitimate complaint, which is, this instructor makes me feel unsafe. This instructor makes me feel like I'm in danger of of I don't know what. And one of the primary things that you'll hear is this instructor is too disorganized. You'll hear that a lot. The instructor is disorganized. And I have to say, I am fairly disorganized. I'll get into more of that later. But as an instructor, I can at times get disorganized because teaching is an evolving task that is happening in the moment. It's sort of like preparing for a therapy session. Young novice therapists often try to prepare for a session. They say, okay, in this session, I'm going to get this done. And 99% of the time that never happens because the situation has its own factors that you can't predict, and stuff's going to happen. Well, teaching is kind of the same way. And so there are times that I'm really disorganized, and people will complain about that sometimes, but they'll never revolt. And the reason why, I think, is because I spend a good amount of time really making sure that the students feel safe. And I do that by being very explicit, by telling them that you're safe here, and here are the things that you can fail my class for, which are, I believe, a kind of limited set. But here are the things you'll never fail my class for. I will never fail you for expressing your opinion or criticizing me or, not talking. That's the other thing I tell students is like, you don't have to talk in my class. If you don't want to participate, you don't have to. Because I was a shy person when I was in graduate school, and I hated it when instructors said, you have to participate at least once every time we talk. And I found that to be just incredibly stupid. It's like, okay, so now I'm raising my hand because I feel like I need to get a good grade in this class. And so I'm just going to say something. And I just find that to be really like treating us like children. I treat people like adults, and I say, look, if you have something to say it. And try to participate. But, if you find that everyone else is saying what is on your mind and you don't feel like participating that day, then go ahead, don't. I'm not keeping track. And, as long as you're learning, that's the most important thing. I'm not evaluating you on your extrovertedness or your comfort level with speaking in class. So I'll tell people that. I'll be like, you're safe in that you can be a shy person, you can be a talkative person, it's fine. You can not know things. You can be stressed out. You can question my teaching ability or whatever. There's a lot of things you can do to me that will never get you failed. And because I don't, it doesn't matter to me, it's fine. It's just part of the process. And so, and I spent a lot of time the other thing is explaining the requirements of the course. A lot of instructors, they just breeze over that and just assume that, the students will figure it out. No, they won't. Students, particularly new graduate students, when you say, write a 10-page paper about this topic, they might have no idea how to even start that assignment. And so, you have to walk them through it. Now, a lot of instructors will be like, well, they should know, and screw them for signing up for graduate school when they don't know how to write a paper. And it's just like, well, okay, but a little bit of help, a little bit of anxiety easing, a little bit of instruction, and maybe you give them a sample paper. In all my classes, I always give them a sample paper, and I say, this is a good paper. If you write a paper like this, you will likely pass this class. So, because as a student, when I took classes, there were times when I would have no idea what sort of paper the instructor was looking for. And I find that a lot of instructors are just like, well, that's good. Anxiety is good. I want you to feel that ambiguity. And I do not agree with that. Because when I'm scared and confused and in a fight or flight response, I'm not learning. I'm just surviving. And so I want students to feel safe. But I also want them to know that if you do not do your work and you do not respond to feedback well, that's another thing I tell students is that I have no problem with someone making a mistake. I have no problem with someone writing a shitty paper. What I do have a problem with is when I read a shitty paper and I detail every little thing because I'll mark every period that's off. I'll mark every citation that's wrong. I'll mark every object of a sentence that is incorrect. I'll point out where a topic sentence should go. I will meticulously go through the entire paper and do my job as an instructor to point out to you what is wrong with this paper and what is going well in this paper. So I have no problem with any of that. It's a little frustrating, but it's fine. What I do have a supreme problem with is when you rewrite the paper and you have not addressed, most of the comments that I have easily laid out for students to actually follow. That's when I have a problem, because there's nothing wrong with making a mistake as a clinician, but there is something supremely wrong with not listening to your supervisor or your instructor about what you're doing wrong and try to correct it. I tell people, if you don't understand what I told you, make sure you get it. Because if I get another paper from you and it has the exact same mistake as something that I compassionately pointed out to you and clearly pointed out to you in the past, and you didn't ask me to clarify that, you will automatically flunk this class. I have no patience for that shit. If I'm going to do my job and teach you something and give you feedback, and you're just going to blow it off or look at the feedback and go, well, I don't really get that. Fuck it. I'll just move on in life. Like, I know clinicians who are like that. I know supervisees who are like that. And that is a big red flag, not only just because it's super annoying as an instructor and supervisor, but to be a good clinician, you have to be responsive to feedback from your supervisors and from your clients. And if you're just one of those people who just forges ahead and doesn't listen to feedback and doesn't respond well and doesn't learn or doesn't try to learn from what people are telling you, then you're going to be a terrible therapist and you're going to hurt people. You're going to harm those around you. And I'm not going to let people like that enter the field. And so I will come down hard on that. Again, if people write a shitty paper, I don't come down hard on that at all, because, what are you going to do? You wrote a shitty paper. It's fine. Obviously you don't know how to write a paper that well. That's not a big deal to me. What is a big deal to me is when I give you a corrective bit of feedback and you do not correct it. Now, some things are harder to correct, like write with more clarity or understand this concept better. I'd never destroy someone over that because it's harder. But if I say to someone, the way you're citing this is incorrect. Here is the correct way. You need a comma here. You need a parentheses here. And in your next paper, you just don't follow that instructions that I very clearly laid out. That's a huge red flag that you are going to harm the public. And so I have no problem with funking people like that. So again, you have to be very clear to your students about what is going to get them in trouble and what will not. And the gestalt that I hope students come away with, which I think most of them do, is I'm a hard ass on some things, but for the vast majority of activities that happen in class and communication with me, like you're safe, you're free. You can say what you want. You can be what you want. You can express what you want. You can ask me what you want, and I will answer quickly. I will respond to emails right away. I will, let you call me on a Thursday night if you need help. I'll support you. I care, all those things. But there's this other side that I have a responsibility for that I will have no problem, initiating, especially because I told you in very firm terms, at least a couple of times, and it's written in my syllabus very clearly. Okay. But again, relationship. It's all having to do with the relationship. That's the first important thing, and everything else is built on that. You can be very firm as an instructor, but if you don't have a good relationship and your students don't like you, everything will fall apart. Okay, the next bit of advice I have is to plan ahead. You want to plan ahead for every class. You want to have a firm plan that you're willing to be flexible in once you are in class. But one of the most annoying things that I found about instructors that I had when I was in graduate school were instructors who just kind of showed up and were just like, okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the readings, and I'm just going to lead a discussion. They'd sit down and be like, okay, let's talk about the readings. And then we would proceed to, the students would do all the talking and the instructor would be like, anybody else? Anybody else? And I'd be sitting here thinking, okay, I'm sort of interested in what my fellow students think about the readings, but really I'm more importantly, I'm interested in what the instructor, whom we are all paying to do this job. I want the instructor to do something, teach me something, tell me something, guide me, don't just stand there and facilitate discussions. We can do that. We can do this on our own time. I could get together with my classmates and we can talk about things, and that's fine. But I don't know how much I'm going to learn from that, because these are just fellow students who are just as oblivious as I am. I want to hear from you, someone who we pay to synthesize all this and to guide us. And I find it to be a very lazy way of teaching. And so you want to show up with a plan. You want to have, now maybe the plan is we're going to discuss chapters in a book. That's fine. But there has to be other things in there, It has to be things that you are offering. You are the teacher. You need to teach. And now, on the other hand, you don't want to have a plan where it's just you lecturing the whole time, and I've had other instructors at the other end of the spectrum, and they show up and they have a PowerPoint and they just read their PowerPoint for 3 hours. I'm just like, ugh, So you want to break it up. You want to mix up your activities. Discussion for 15 minutes, PowerPoint for 15 minutes, small groups for 15 minutes. You take a break, maybe some quiet time where they write, back to lecture, watch a video. You want to mix it up because no matter how good someone is at paying attention in a boring class, you do anything for 3 hours straight, your brain starts to get a little weird. I try to follow a general rule when possible that I don't do any one activity for longer than 15 minutes, because I have learned from experience that students will get very sleepy and their eyes will gloss over if you go for, like 45 minutes or something, even if you're super riveting. I've made that mistake. I've developed like these what I consider to be super well-researched presentations, and invariably at about the, 45-minute mark, 60-minute mark, even though the students, I can tell, are interested, they start, their energy is like slowly draining out of their feet, So it's important to break things up. Now, breaking stuff up could be, you talk about, maybe 3 hours you're talking, like I have a whole lecture about grief. And when I first developed my lecture on grief, it was, again, very well researched, and I had a lot of different anecdotes and videos and all this kind of stuff. But what I didn't realize was that I still need to do my general practice of every once in a while sort of mixing up the activity from the student side, meaning that maybe I have a worksheet, just like about 20 minutes in, they just answer a couple questions on a worksheet. It's a shift in the brain activity. Instead of them absorbing stuff from you, they're now thinking and writing. And that's a different mode of the brain. And it keeps people awake, essentially, to put it bluntly. When I first started teaching, I've talked about this before, but when I first started teaching, I was, low rank. And so I didn't get to pick and choose the courses I wanted to teach. And so I always got the shitty courses to teach, which were always the time slots that no one wanted to teach, which was 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. Imagine that. Some of you out there go to bed at like 8, Well, I would teach a class from 7 at night till 10 o'clock at night for 3 hours straight. So, and there was always a good half of the class who, this was like way past their bedtime. And here I am teaching a class, 16 students, and there would be, if I was being boring, I would instantly realize it by, an ever-growing amount of students who were having sleepy eyes and their head was bobbing because they're falling asleep. And so early in my career, I had to learn how to be an entertainer. I had to learn how to do a song and dance and keep things moving and keep it varied and keep it interesting and, to keep people awake. And I found that to be a very good trial by fire experience. And I use those principles now, whether my students seem to be tired or not. Although the other week, I I went on a tangent about trauma therapy, and I noticed like half the students were falling asleep. And then but I was so into the topic as an instructor, I didn't realize it until I switched gears. And I realized, oh, everyone was asleep during the last bit. I mean, not actually asleep, but falling asleep anyway. So, you make mistakes, but all right. The next bit of advice is to incorporate feedback from your students. Let your students teach you how to be the best teacher you can be. Know that you do not know how to teach perfectly, and that students have a lot of really great things to say. And so when they have feedback for you, like, I like this, I don't like that, I like this, I don't like that, even if they're mean about it or they don't seem to be very good communicators, really listen to that, because it can only make you a better teacher when you really, the same goes for when you're a therapist, right? Or just a spouse, or, any sort of person. If you really listen to the negative feedback and think, okay, that hurt, but what can I do to make that work for me? What do I have to do? I didn't realize that's how I was coming across. And what do I need to do to change that about myself? And, it's a horrible thing to get negative feedback. I know most instructors take it really hard. When I was a student, I thought instructors didn't care. I thought they're instructors, they're confident, they're at the peak of their career. Why would they care what I think about them? Well, when you become an instructor, you realize that your ego is laid wide open as an instructor, because, you care, you're trying hard, and it's sort of like when you go to a restaurant and you don't like the food, and you're just like, this food sucks. This hamburger is overcooked. The fries are soggy. This food is terrible. Well, imagine now if you are cooking for your friends, okay, and you're having a dinner party, and you're like, oh, okay, Friday night, my friends are coming over. I'm making them paella, and I'm going to go to the store, and it's my mom's recipe, and I've made it a few times, and this is my special dish. And you get everything ready, and you feed your your friends, and then half of your friends during the meal just vocalize that, oh, this is dry. I would, this is the worst paella I've ever had. Oh, the presentation, not great. Imagine how shitty you would feel about yourself. You would just be like, and you'd be hurt, and you'd be upset. You'd be like, really? Like, you're not going to at least try to act like you like this? I really tried, Now, you should listen to that feedback, right? You should be like, oh, okay, well, how can I make paella better? But it's also gonna really destroy you, and you're probably never gonna want to do that again. You're gonna be like, fuck it, I'm never having a dinner party again. Well, the same goes for restaurants, by the way. Often there's someone who is in charge of the food and feels like they're putting their best foot forward. So you just have to be really careful about feedback. You just have to have empathy and understand. And I find that a lot of people who listen to this podcast on YouTube in particular, there's a lot of immature people on YouTube who just like, this is dumb, get to the point, and I'm just like, obviously you're immature, or you're young and naturally immature, and or you've never produced anything and put something up there for someone to criticize. And so as a teacher, it's natural to just, your ego is just laid wide open. Now, as a student, it's not your responsibility to care for your teacher per se, but anyway, this is advice for teachers. So just know that it's normal to be extremely anxious. When I got my first batch of evaluations on the very first course I taught 20 years ago, I had there were handwritten forms. They still are at the university. And they're handwritten forms that the students fill out at the end of the quarter about, your strengths and your weaknesses as an instructor. And so I hadn't looked at them. I kept them in my bag, and I was like, well, I got to look at those things. I can't just throw them away. I have to look. I have to read them. I hope there's good feedback, but what about negative feedback? And those things would just be burning a hole in my bag for like days. finally, I just went to the Hurricane, which was right next to the old Antioch campus. It used to be called the Doghouse. They've torn it down since, but it was this 24-hour diner, one of those places that people go after the bars close. And I went there in the afternoon and got a very stiff vodka drink. I'll never forget it. I was just like, give me a double vodka with very little soda. And I drank that, and then I read my evaluations because I was like, okay, I felt like I was in a 60s sitcom. I need a drink for this, and it, ever since then, it's just been a little bit better every time I've had to do that. But I still, it's been 20 some years teaching, and I just got some evaluations back recently, and my body tenses up before I read those things, even though I know I'm not going to get fired, and I know that, and I have, just not to brag, but I have like the vast majority of people who give me feedback, it's positive. And whenever they do give me negative feedback, it's pretty minor. And so if anyone should feel, I don't know, okay with, or even looking forward to reading their evaluations, it should be me, right? But it doesn't, man. It's just, and whenever I talk to other instructors, they all feel the same way. Everyone has their own way of dealing with it. Some people sort of build a real thick skin and just say like, well, what are you going to do? I did my best. But I know from experience, particularly novice instructors, that it is really hard. So just get ready for that and get ready for that feeling, get support, vent, but don't shut yourself off, and incorporate feedback. And that's what I always tell my students. I'm like, I am totally open to negative feedback because the reason why everything that I do today, or many of the things I do today as a teacher, is because I was correcting for negative feedback that I received in the past. And so if there's anything that I did this quarter that you didn't like, let me know, because, I'll maybe there's something I can do for the next batch of students, So there's that. Another bit of advice is establish how students can fail. I've already been over that because I sort of jumped the gun on that one. But again, so just to conclude, the most important thing is you really need to connect with your students. You really need to, now, I guess I'm talking to instructors who teach very small classes. If you're teaching 1,000 students, I guess it'd be kind of hard to connect. But I think you can still connect to large groups. Anyway, the point is that students, they want to like you, and they really need to trust you, and they deserve to trust you. They need to know that you're trying to help them. They deserve to know that you're trying to help them, because they'll assume that you don't really care, because you look as an instructor so accomplished in their eyes, and they'll feel like, well, they don't care about me, and they got better things to do than worry about me. But you really do worry about them, and you really do care, and you really do care about your job. If you're an instructor, again, because you're not getting paid that much, you're doing it mostly as a calling. And so, communicate that. Tell them you really do care, and tell them that you think about them. And, I try to tell my students that they are major priorities in my life. I have a lot of different things that I do with my work, but my students are my number one priority. And I do. There are times when I'll be driving in my car and daydreaming, and I'll think about my students and be like, okay, where are they? What are they doing? What do I need to do to help them? How are they feeling? And that's, that's why I do it. That's the calling part of it. I'm not doing it for the money, because I could be making money in other places. I'm doing it somewhat for the money, but I could have been paid more doing other things. I'm not doing it for the glamour, because there's, where's the glamour, or the glory, or the fame, or something. There's none of that, believe me. I'm doing it because I care about the students' development, and I want to be the teacher. I want to be a version of the best teachers I ever had to them, and I want to protect them from the worst teachers that I had when I was in graduate school. So I want them to know that I do think about them, and that they're important to me, and that they can depend on me, and that I'm there for them, and because students deserve that. And mainly because in my program, the students are there because they're trying to make the world a better place. And why would I want to stand in the way of that? I mean, why would I want to stand in the way of someone helping another human being? one. Number two, if I can actually help them to be a better helper to those people, man, I can die happy. I can die tomorrow and say, man, that was meaningful to me. And I did not waste my time on this planet. I tried to help people to help others. I consider that to be just a massive, noble cause, not, to, pump sunshine up my own butt, but that's how I feel about it. And that's how I feel about my students. I consider what they're doing as noble. And if I can help them to do that noble cause, then I feel like it was worth the time. Whereas, other things that I do with my job, I don't necessarily feel that way about it. I might be interested in the task, but I'm not, it doesn't resonate with me the way that does. All right. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Let me know what you think. If you want to email me at contact@psychologyinseattle.com, or go to our website and fill out the Contact Us page. If you plan on coming to the live show on August 11, 2018 at the North City Bistro here in Shoreline, which is just above Seattle, then send me a bio about yourself, because during the show, I'm going to, spend, 30 seconds highlighting different people in the audience who have sent me information about themselves. A picture, if you could, would be great. And maybe something interesting about yourself. And, I think it'd be a good way to, just make it a little cozy experience for us and you guys. So again, just send it to contact@psychologyinseattle.com. A few of you have already sent stuff, which is great. And so I just want to give everyone the opportunity to do that. Particularly if you're a patron, but only if you're coming to the show, because, and the show, just so you know, is not going to be recorded for the podcast. So if you want to experience the magic, you got to be there. We're going to have all sorts of activities and trivia and swag. We're going to play D&D. We're going to talk about our personal lives. We're going to do Q&A and Tough for Bluff and sing some songs. And Lita is going to be there, one of the original Psychology in Seattle hosts. Okay. At the end, I will tell you, as I do at every episode, please take care of yourself because you deserve it.